Hi, folks. It's Mary Rowe from CUI. We normally give a few minutes here for people to rope themselves into the session. And since it's August and it's hot, or it's getting hotter in a lot of parts of the country, and we think particularly of the parts of the country that are severely challenged by heat and by fires. I heard our colleague Rebecca Alty, the mayor of Yellowknife, this morning talking about evacuating what's going on up there. So this is going to be the summer we will all remember of just extraordinary events that seem to be weather related and climate related, and how we need to just stand together with what the tragedies that are unfolding for people as they evacuate quickly or try to figure out how they're going to actually cope with the aftermath of these events. If you've seen the shots from Hawaii, it's staggering, and that has happened repeatedly across the country. So if you're in a part of the country that is struggling with that, we feel for you, and we are concerned and committed to the resilience of our communities across the country, and look forward to figuring out together how we're going to make our places more resilient, have better adaptive capacity, and be able to cope better with whatever these kind of climate-related resilience challenges are ahead of us. So just acknowledging that. I'm in Toronto today. I happen to be at my home because I'm getting a flight this afternoon to Ottawa. I'm often at the office, though, and I hope many of you are back at the office, because we know that that is another part of the puzzle here, and several of our panelists are in their offices. And we need to continue to remind ourselves what cities are about, which is an experience of being with other people and engaging with other people who aren't like us and who we don't necessarily live with. So I just want to acknowledge that we continue to monitor that carefully and look at what the new patterns are, and what a great topic we have today on mobility, and how what an essential ingredient that is for cities to be able to enable that kind of cross collaboration and connection that urban dynamism, urban vitality, and urban economic life and cultural life is dependent on, us being able to connect with one another and get to various places. And how do we do that in a way that's sustainable? So in Toronto, traditional territory, as we know, of a number of First Nations, Inuit and Métis, specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat peoples, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and still home to many different diverse First Nations. We continue to come to terms with what true reconciliation needs to look like in this country, and how does that affect the policy decisions that we make, the investment decisions that we make, and how we engage with one another. So another reason for us to make sure we get our butts into neighborhoods that aren't our own, and be able to have some direct experience of how other people live and cope, and what they're coping with. So urbanists unite, the city is ours, and we need to chart our future together as best we can. So I'm going to ask the folks that are coming together on this session to expose their screens so that people can see you. And I hope that you're all going to tonight have a really lively conversation at your dinner table about what the hell is MaaS. I used to work for an organization in New York called MaaS 1A. And so this is, I don't know, is it MaaS? Is it MaaS? I'm going to hear from the experts what we actually call it. But it is a whole new way of understanding mobility. And we've been very appreciative to work with AECOM, because they have been our great partner on imagining what this could look like in one particular jurisdiction, one particular region, the GTHA, but it is relevant across the country. And so I'm hoping people are checking in where they got our thanks gang, where they're coming in from, so that we can see how this is relevant to other parts of the country. This is not specific. The challenge is certainly not specific to Toronto, but nor the solutions. And so we're going to hear specifically about the scope of this particular work. But what I'm hoping we're going to really talk about is how do we move forward in all our urban communities to understand what mobility as a service could look like, what the potential is, and how do we need to commit ourselves to it? And could there be a more poignant moment to do that when we're seeing such dramatic impacts of GHGs, which largely come from transportation? Just saying. So thanks, gang, for joining us. Thanks for coming on to CityTalk. As you know, we have a lively chat function. You're all living up to that advanced billing by chat. Remember, we publish the chat. We create a transcript from this meeting, from this discussion. We publish the chat. We also run a video of this. You can see that. It lives on our website forever. So does the chat. So just keep that in mind when you're in lively exchange on the chat. Just remember, it's kept for posterity. So that's important. And we have learned a lot from chats, and we hope you'll continue to use that platform. And if you've got some questions you want to have raised, make sure your toggle switch says everyone, so that everybody sees them. Sometimes the question can easily be answered by somebody on the chat rather than the panelists who are busy talking to each other. So let everybody see it. I'll watch it too. and off we go. So first off is going to be Leandro, who works with us at CUI, was one of the lead partners with AECOM on the project. And so Leandro, I'll go to you first, then I'm going to go to Justin, and then we're going to talk to our colleagues across into US cities and in Toronto. So Leandro, over to you, please, to give us a little overview on the report. And we hope everybody will read the report, obviously. But Leandro, you're going to tell us sort of the highlights.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So CUI partnered with AECOM to study the desirability and feasibility of implementing mobility as a service in the Greater Toronto Area. What we really aimed to do with the report was to create a starting point or a common language in order to advance the conversation about MaaS's application, its benefits within the region. What we found is that if co-designed intentionally with communities and implemented with the goal of addressing transportation equity challenges, MaaS does have the potential to introduce more flexibility, inclusivity, affordability, and connectivity in our mobile networks. What I'd really like to do is echo the call from thought leaders that we had engaged throughout the process for the need to rethink transit delivery. Since mobility access is such an integral part of every individual's quality of life, transit needs to be tailored beyond just serving peak hour commutes to really accommodate people whose lifestyles and work patterns fall outside of that range. What our work does is highlight the potential for MaaS to help. So what is MaaS? Mobility as a service. It's an integrated platform for transportation services. It combines multiple modes, including public transit, ride-hailing, scooter, bike and car sharing, and sometimes even parking fees and road tolls on one easy-to-use navigation and payment app. But what does successful MaaS look like if it were to be implemented properly for an urban region? Well, what we heard is that it's mobility options in all communities, in all geographies, at all times of the day to really help people access their daily recreational, employment, and social needs. One thing to keep in mind is that on-demand services are really just one small part of a MaaS system. And it's really about creating a truly multimodal system with public transit as its foundation. When considered as part of a more comprehensive approach to land use and transportation planning, MaaS can support the significant expansion of mobility options for all communities. The good news is that there are many initiatives in the GTA that are currently underway that MaaS can build upon. Urban intensification, urban growth centers, local and regional transit investment, public realm improvements to accommodate active transportation, such as walking and cycling, and alternate transit delivery models currently being tested by municipalities. We found that MaaS could help plug gaps in existing transit networks to expand the geographic reach of mobility access, especially in suburban and transit-dependent communities. What we heard from stakeholders is that one of the main barriers to successful MaaS implementation, especially within a regional context, is a possible misalignment between the public and private sector. We also have to keep in mind that the GTA is made up of many municipalities, each with its own jurisdictions, its own council-approved directions, its own transit networks. So what we found, CUI and AECOM, is that the real starting point to advance this conversation is really bringing together a multi-sectoral group of partners representing transit agencies, the province, municipalities, private mobility operators, as well as nonprofits and community organizations. We're really hopeful that this is possible. And from what we heard in our engagement, private mobility operators are willing to augment public transit systems. The transit agencies within the GTA are already in a collaborative environment, really good relationships being built across the municipalities. And really looking forward to seeing how this conversation advances. So I'd like to leave space for the panelists, so I will step back and slink away into the background. If you have any questions about the report, you can check it in the chat. There should be a link, and I'll be available for any questions.
Thanks, Leandro. That's great. And I appreciate every time we do one of these, all of our colleagues and staff, we learn a ton. So I appreciate that so much of our work together is more about inquiry and common inquiry. We don't always have the answers. And this is, as we always say about CityTalk, it's the beginning of the conversation. It's never the end. So Justin, take us into the sort of belly of the beast here in terms of what your particular broad interest has been in this. And I guess the one question I always have is, what are we solving for? What is the problem that we're actually trying to fix? So maybe you can just give us a sense from your perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you. And great to be here and nice to see so many people in the chat. This really started back in the pandemic. And you mentioned getting everybody back downtown in cities and actually being together. That was the driver for it. It was, how can we reactivate downtown? And we'd gone around a number of the transit agencies and we've been talking to them, and we'd seen these sort of marks in long-term strategy, maybe 5 years out. Let's do a MaaS solution, or there's a micromobility. And there was these sort of dots out there somewhere that were quite solution focused, really. And I think you said it perfectly there, Mary. And I think there was an English architect I often quote called Cedric Price, who in the 60s said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And that's what we suddenly started thinking was, there's all of these possible solutions and they're all valid and they solve various things, but what is the flavor that we wanted to talk about here? As we look around the city, we'd seen, a widening equity gap.
Is it just me, or does anybody else not hear? We've lost Justin completely. It's all good. Okay, well, we'll get back to Justin. I don't know. It's often the case that the worst internet coverage comes from somebody who's in the middle of an urban center. Just saying. So we can't always predict. But what I'd like to do now is go to our colleagues, Tosh, Matthew, and Deborah, to give us a little. Justin, is he coming back? We'll let him come back when he comes back. To
we can't do that on our own.
Justin, we are not hearing you well. You are weaving in and out. So what I'm going to suggest we do is that the tech folks are going to talk with you to see if they can figure out what's going on, maybe get you on a different channel. And I'm going to go to Deborah and Matthew and Tosh to see if I can get a perspective. So Deborah, can I go to you first? Because can I just say that as a layperson, I'm not a planner. People think I'm a planner, but I am not a planner, not an architect. I'm not an urban designer. It's hard to know really what the hell I am, but I'm none of those things. So I ask kind of dumb questions. And one of them would be this. I always think of transit as being big, subways, streetcars, large systems. But I think this discipline of MaaS, you're trying to say, well, no, actually, let's get it into smaller bites. Yeah, am I right? Or am I wrong?
Well, that's an interesting paradigm you're suggesting. Let me first say, I was so proud to be part of this effort.
Great.
I actually do a lot more work in North America and have run transit agencies in North America. And my company actually works with a number of them around North America and have spent a fair amount of time in Canada. So it's always good to be working with Canadian colleagues, because I actually own property in New Brunswick, by the way. So I'm a little Canadian here.
You're an honorary Canadian.
No transit in the place I own. But anyway, so that's a really interesting question. I think that the MaaS is the opportunity is to link everything, because the customer base knows that there is a linkage. We have small, large, we know that as a customer, we know that all these things fit into it because we all have a different travel pattern, whether it's a scooter or walking. Most people aren't just on transit. And of course, in the smaller communities, there are small systems, but there's pieces of it that fit into the mobility that each of us try to access, right? So what I love about this concept is it starts to be realistic about what is our mobility pattern in our urban and suburban and rural areas, and try to link it so that we get the most efficiency of those systems and we enhance the experience for the customers. That's one of the things I loved about the findings in this. But there's been a lot of barriers, as Leandro said, to getting people to come together and acknowledge those other pieces of the program, which also then gets into land use, et cetera. So there's just so many levels and layers that you go through to look at the whole system. Thanks for that question, Mary.
Which I guess is the point, is that what we're saying is that it's a whole system, right? And so we hear these different little buzz phrases, last mile, all that kind of stuff. But I wonder if there's a way for us, and is that what this clumsy acronym is supposed to be, is that mobility is fundamentally a service. And so we're trying to say cities and city regions and even smaller communities provide different mobility services. Is that the mind shift you're trying to get us all to make?
Absolutely. And
Right.
it's also then thinking, as you're an urbanist sitting in Toronto, thinking about how the decisions are that shape that mobility pattern. I spend time in the New York area, but also I'm in Maine right now today, and they're
Right.
talking about wanting to put railroads in, but they don't have the land use to be able to support it. And they don't understand that that's not probably the best financial decision to make. So how do you link the smaller things to create hubs or whatever? But it goes back to the decisions that are made in the community at the level, local, state, and regional levels. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about how we look at that on a larger scale of region, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me go now to Tosh. Tosh, can you just bring us into your world here about what your perspective is, what your background is, and what your sort of approach is? And as just keep in mind, I mean, I can see on the chat, we've got lots of people in the chat who know a whole lot about this whole discipline discourse. But just if you can just give us the basics as well, that would be great. And then we'll get to Matthew next. Go ahead, Tosh.
Yeah, absolutely. So to give some background, I have been a manager of the program Move PGH based here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a collaboration between all of the mobility services in the city, including transit, bike share, scooter share, car share, but also folding in some of the technology elements. So we work with the transit app to kind of present all of those options and coordinate them. So we've actually just concluded our 2-year pilot of this program and are continuing it and now in kind of this evaluation and iteration phase. But yeah, a lot of my work has been to, test out the scooter program, which was kind of novel in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania in general, seeing how dockless mobility can fit into that transit ecosystem, into that multimodal system, and, hopefully kind of fill in some of those gaps. We have a great legacy transit system, but it doesn't get everywhere, everyone everywhere all the time. So we have done a little bit of work to try to introduce additional services as a city, working with nonprofits and private entities just as well. This is all kind of a program to link all of those options, provide information through technology, because I think a lot of people don't really know about all of the transportation options that they can utilize to get them around. And particularly linking between those options, you can gain a lot of efficiency in cost and time. Presenting our services in a way that makes that easier for residents has really been a primary goal.
It's interesting, don't leave, Tosh, because it's interesting to me what you're suggesting here that, I think a lot of people think that transit is something that is centrally controlled, municipally run, and they don't necessarily, I'm old enough to remember really when bikes weren't considered anything. Like if you rode a bike, it was for fun. It wasn't actually to get yourself anywhere. So all of a sudden now, it's kind of like a democratization of options, and it doesn't all have to be run by one central transit agency. Am I right? I mean, that's in essence what you're trying to do, is pull together a whole bunch of things. Now, coming to you next, Matthew, because I want to ask about equity. So go ahead, Tosh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's how we're looking at it, and that kind of that thought has really been evolving. Bikes, scooters, and really all other modes are types of shared mobility. Whether you're sharing on one vehicle or sharing the vehicle at different times. These are assets that we can, make a lot of benefit from just by making investments in infrastructure in those companies who are running their services here. There's a lot of connections to be made between those services that I think needs some kind of organizer that may not be the city. It could be a nonprofit like we've managed here. To get all of those agencies to speak together, because I think they all recognize that they have their own niche in the transportation ecosystem, and they all benefit by working together, is what we found.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to see on the chat. I see our old friend and colleague Dan Hornwig is on. Dan, so nice to see you. And he's plugged a study here that they've done at Ontario Tech about what the implications would be if we made this more available to Ontarians. But Dan is a person who's worked in the Global South. And I see we have Michael coming into us from Ghana, who's saying, wait a sec, in Africa, this is something that's being talked about more and more. And I know that Benjamin de la Pena, who's been on CityTalk and who's a senior fellow with COI, is with the Shared Mobility Center in Chicago and is constantly talking about what we can learn from the Global South and how do we actually allow ourselves to just be much more open to all the different solutions. So I appreciate people coming in on the chat, and Dan's put a report in there. Everybody have a look at it, and any other reports people know about and anything that they can provide to Michael from Ghana, please plug it into the chat. So I want to ask about equity, because again, I feel like this conversation can quickly become seen as something that only fit 30-year-olds with a lot of resources and no child or no disability can do. And so how do we make sure that we are extending, that if we're going to embrace this mobility as a service concept, that it means that a whole bunch of different kinds of folks and more folks have access to mobility choices? Matthew, talk to us from your experience on the Mobilizing Justice Project. You're part of a huge study to try to concretize this. Tell us what you're learning and what's your view.
Sure. So I'll just start with an introduction. My name is Matt Palm. I'm an assistant professor at University of North Carolina in city planning. I lead the pilots program at Mobilizing Justice. So we evaluate new technology, new policies, new programs from equity perspectives. And we're always on the lookout for new projects. So shameless plug, I'll drop it in the chat. If you've got a project that you think would be interested to evaluate from an equity standpoint, always reach out to us. You know, Mary, I agree with your sentiment. When I first heard about mobility as a service, I thought, ooh, I don't know, this is a lot of buzzwords, a lot of tech, I don't know, is this really going to help folks? But I think the answer is it can, if it's designed in the right way, and if equity is centered in the process. And I'll actually note that in Pittsburgh, I don't know if this is still the case, but for a time, correct me if I'm wrong, Tosh, riders who started their trips in specific zones got a 25% discount. And those were zones that were like targeted from an equity standpoint. So mobility as a service can be a way to actually target resources towards equity deserving communities to remove financial barriers to accessing certain services. Mm-hmm. We hear a lot about digital disconnection, but there are ways around that. And I think I'm going to kind of stick my neck out here, at least from an academic perspective, and say that since the end of the pandemic, a lot of the digitally disconnected barriers are being resolved, at least in the major urban areas in Canada. It's a different story in the United States. It's a different story in remote communities where the infrastructure necessarily isn't there. But in major urban Canadian cities, I would say the digital disconnection barrier is not what it was 10 years ago. And so there's really an opportunity for mobility as a service to reach everyone. But again, that's also contingent on, real partnerships with community groups that are on the ground in different neighborhoods, like, Jane and Finch in Toronto or Cabbagetown, where people who are based in the community, organizations that are based in the community are working with your service providers to help train people, because it can be overwhelming and a bit confusing at the start.
I am with you on that. I've got to say, and I meant to write something about this to see if anybody would pay any attention, but in my part of Toronto, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's massive construction and rerouting because of the Ontario line and various projects. And I live on the Queen streetcar, and everything is getting rerouted. Broadview is out, Queen is out, and it's quite confusing. Is it the Dundas car? Is it the King car? And it's overwhelming to try to navigate it, even if you use your little app, right? And so the TTC put people out with little pennies. Did anybody else see this? I see my neighbor Isabel's on the call. I bet she saw it. There are people have little pennies on, identifying them as a TTC employee, and you could go up to them and say, I have to get to where? And they'd say, oh yeah, take this, take that. I can't tell you how reassuring it was for me. I realize I'm a woman of a certain age, but I'm an urbanist. I navigate this stuff all the time. To have a person there available to us, and I thought, boy, we've sort of lost that capacity to have an individual who can navigate with you. When we were young, you had a bus driver you knew. And so I think we have to see if we can. I appreciate all the technology you brainiacs are bringing to this, but there's also just the human piece. there's the human piece of someone helping us figure this out and help us navigate. And then when we get a hang of it, we can do it. Justin is back. Justin, your internet is magically restored itself. Why don't you finish where you were? And then I appreciate Wendy having us all on the screen like this so we can all see each other. This is the bun fight section where everybody gets to interrupt everybody else. So you don't have to wait for me to call on you, but I'll ask a few questions and then you can all have in. Justin, finish where you were.
No, it's perfect. I mean, I think, talking about technology being the solution, we've just discovered firsthand there that it can be a bit of a challenge. But I think what I was saying was, technology being the solution. What was the question? I really like the point that Matthew made about the prototyping. Actually, I'd perhaps just jump to that a little bit. Okay. They often describe some of these big social political issues as wicked problems in messy contexts. And there's this idea that sort of one personal body can just solve it by just thinking about it and out goes a solution is no longer the way of doing it. And so I think back to the Smart Cities Challenge 5, 6, 7 years ago, and was involved on the West Coast looking at mobility as a service for connecting First Nations to education. Really good social outcome kind of piece there. But for all the sort of sitting and think about it, it wasn't until you could actually get to the pilot stage and try it would you discover the things that did or didn't work. And so I think we're talking about maybe solutions here, but I think the process is actually the most critical piece. How are you going to get down to there? Because the piece that you discover at the end of it might not be the thing you thought you were going to solve at the end of the day. There's so many things you could accidentally solve and loads of theories you prove wrong. And so we've got to be able to set up in a way that allows this iterative prototyping, as Matthew said. And I think that's more important than imagining a solution itself.
The thing that I love about this notion, fancy term there, Justin, iterative prototyping, is basically let's try some stuff, right? Yeah, how do we do it in small enough scales that if it fails, you haven't inconvenienced tens of thousands of people. You've affected a smaller number. Oop, tried that, didn't work. So I think, I lived in New York for a number of years, and that was the kind of magic that Jeanette Sadekhan introduced. She said, we're going to pilot some stuff in limited, and people could tolerate that. Okay, we'll put up with the pilot. Invariably, of course, the pilot sticks, but still, it's an iterative prototyping approach, and it gets it into smaller pieces. So I've got all of you here. We've got lots of people in the chat asking questions. Here's my sort of first open question. What are we not doing in Canada that we need to do to enable more mobility as a service approaches? What are the impediments or the constraints preventing us from wrapping our arms around it and trying it? And Americans never need to hesitate about telling Canadians what they think. So feel free to speak up and tell us what you've learned in your jurisdiction. What do you think? Or tell us where to start, I guess.
I'm happy to sort of throw a comment in there as well. I think technology problems are often people problems too, or more people problems than they are technology problems. And it's that coming together piece that was mentioned earlier. We've been around the region here and plenty of other places where we've been trialing parts of it, whether it's a micro-mobility solution, or even to your point about, personal interaction. The TTC's got a great Wheel-Trans program that you can phone up via a phone if you can't operate the technology, but everyone's got their own little version of it. And it reminds me a little bit of a few years ago when I had all these health apps on my phone, one for running, one for eating, one for something else. And I had all these little nuggets of information. And if I wanted to feel fit, I looked at one app. And if I wanted to feel like I needed to do more, I looked at the results of another. But none of them came together until Apple said, here's the way that we can connect them all together and you can talk about it in the same manner. And I think we need to parallel that to Cityscape. We're in the place where everyone's trying to do really good things and they've got these micro solutions. But until we bring them together and everybody collectively says, okay, this is the one version, this is one flavor we're going after first, that's when the success starts to happen. And I think that's where we are with the MaaS thing. Everyone's trying little pieces, but we need to come together and have ownership as well.
So maybe there's both, right? We often say at COI, we're in the connective tissue business. You want to have Antigonish trying some stuff and you want Abbotsford to try some stuff. And then part of what we do is say, hey, did you know what each other is doing in opposite parts of the country? So it's kind of both. You don't want to, because that's what I always worry about is if we want to sit back and wait for a big grand solution, we lose that iterative prototyping. Deborah, what in your experience do you think is the place to start?
Well, actually, this is just wonderful. I'd like to make a couple of comments about the iterative process and the pilots. what I've seen be really successful is when the agencies that are rolling out a technology solution, like when Omni was rolled out in New York, it was contactless payment. They did it as a pilot with the employees and some of the contractors, and they documented that and they improved it. But sometimes there's a concern about, well, if we do a pilot and it doesn't go well, everyone's going to criticize the agency. So we have to be able to celebrate what Justin just said and say, pilots are great. Let's do this and experiment and share those experiences. And Mary, they had the low tech when they started to roll it out on certain lines. They had employees out there as ambassadors. That still works. Ever since I was early days of my transit life, that's what we would do. And it's still, people want to see somebody. But I think that there's a couple of other things we need to talk about. And I'm not going to tell Canada how to perform, but I'm going to say what we struggle with in North America is we haven't been access. Just watch what's going on in congestion pricing in New York.
Deborah,
I'm
say it
saying
again.
that
You blipped out. Do it again. Say it again. Or not.
I think the challenge is that we do to provide mobility for the autos. Can you hear me now? No, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Okay.
I know.
So it's linking the public transit, as Leandro said earlier, but it's how we link it to the highway system so we can manage the capacity and do trade-offs. And you all are Toronto's one of the most congested regions, and it's growing faster than any place, right?
Yeah.
And watch New York, congestion pricing. We're having a hard time coordinating. New Jersey has taken New York to court on this, and that's not even linking it to transit. But imagine how you could run your system if we were coordinating that on days that we don't have capacity on the highway. Oh, we'll give you a discount if you get on the transit system or whatever. That's the real frontier in managing, particularly the big urban areas. And that's what I think is very exciting, but that's going to take what we have said, collaboration and good governance around talking about what the customers and the community needs, not what all those different agencies want.
And what's interesting, of course, is that people want to get into places, want to move across jurisdictions. You know, if you take, I mean, you're quite right. The congestion challenge, you can see the chats blowing up because everybody in the GTHA is mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. But, you know, when you go from one system, thank God we now have fair integration, but when you go from one system to another, you don't know as you're a traveler and you don't really care, frankly. You just want the system to work. So I guess that's maybe, I saw Mark Haffen was saying we need a democratization of infrastructure. Matthew, when you're looking at the sort of underpinning conditions that need to be in place to enable the kind of connectivity and coordination Deborah's mentioning, where would you start? What are the enabling conditions to get that kind of coordination?
I mean, I'll actually riff on a technology where we do know a little bit more about what it takes, which is congestion pricing. And, you know, one of the things that shows out in the research is strong political leadership from senior levels of government is essential. A lot of the cases where congestion pricing came into being and or even just like cordon pricing schemes, they had political champions who were willing to spend some political capital to bring all of the different levels of government involved in place. And I also want to riff on something else Deborah said about just bringing the automobile into the conversation more. You know, there are certain private companies out there who will benefit a lot if mobility as a service takes off. That's car insurance companies, right?
Why will they benefit? Why will they benefit?
Because if I'm driving less, I am less of a risk to them and less of a risk in their insurance pool. And so, you know, there's been some research and conversation out there about how you bring them in to this conversation as well, that because, you know, because we're at a point now where a lot of car insurance companies will actually track people's driving, right? Pay as you go, driver's insurance. And so if they can see that, you know, okay, this person is using the C-Scoot, they're driving less, and they can see in the data, this person is taking transit more. I mean, that person is less expensive to insure. And so, you know, maybe they can help offer some incentives to help make that happen.
Good for you. That's a great idea. I mean, it's a bit like getting the insurance companies to pay for retrofits if you're making your home less susceptible to hurricanes and different kinds of disasters. But we've had a hard time getting that industry to move. Anybody here having any success talking to the big bad car companies and the insurance companies about how this could be in their interest? Tosh, anything to throw in on that? Have you tried that in Pittsburgh?
Not so much, admittedly. We have some interesting AV partners here who we had some interaction with, but there wasn't really that much to glean from that. I mean, back to the original kind of question of what suggestions I may have. I think like what we've learned here is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and wins. I don't think you need to look at mobility as a service as this massive program requiring a ton of funding. I think we, pulled together a pretty low budget just to see how we could, contribute some capacity to coordinating some of our partners. A lot of that was just done tactically. We were creating mobility hubs without really breaking ground in concrete. We were just moving some of those elements around, moving around car sharing cars and bike sharing elements so that we were creating these kind of welcoming spaces to shared mobility. And also just like, seeing what we could get from all of these operators in terms of equity pricing, in terms of just some of that, strategic deployment of connecting some of these options. And Matthew mentioned, the equity pricing that we designated certain areas of priority in the city. I think like those are all things that you really just need. You need capacity staff, like people to have those conversations and policies to be able to enforce your operators to play along in that way. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, it doesn't have to be the hardest thing. It can be pretty tactical.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing in the chat here that Kimberly Nelson is saying that back in the old days when she had a car, doesn't have a car anymore apparently, Intact would provide a discount to you if you drove less. Your insurance would be cheaper. So I think this is a very interesting conversation. If there's anybody from the insurance industry willing to expose themselves on our chat, come on in and tell us what the obstacles would be to that. Because if we could create more and more of those financial tools. Go ahead, Matthew.
I was just going to add that, there is an equity link here in that, this is a way of reaching a lot of folks in what we call forced car ownership. Right. In the GTA, as well as here in the States, we have a lot of folks who live in outer suburban communities who aren't necessarily driving by choice. They can't afford it. So they're buying older cars that are less safe, that break down more. And that can be a huge sort of quality of life barrier. But because there's no alternative services, they don't have a choice. And so, I think there's hope for mobility as a service to try and reach those folks by helping make things more affordable as a means of getting alternative modes into some of these communities.
Matthew, can I just push back on that, and then Justin, you can get in. But just to say that I always feel that's what happens is that we take the hardest case. I can speak as a woman, a mom who's got 3 kids, who's got to get to hockey, and she's moving between swim practice and hockey practice. And how is that person not going to function without a car? And I always worry that we then say, well, then, that's a non-issue. We're somehow discriminating against people that have families, as opposed to what I see in the chat, people saying, let's take people like students who somebody has just put in the chat here about York. And how at York, they did a study and looked specifically at a student population where you could get them. So would we be smarter to do that, to be strategic about the folks that we know could leave their car more easily than the parent who's trying to get a kid to a practice? And that versus, do you know what I'm getting at? Like, could we just go for the lower hanging fruit, as they say in the business? Justin, thoughts on that?
No. I think it's certainly the starting point. If you're trying to go for the all outcomes at the beginning, you're probably going to struggle with it. But I think that was the thing that was coming up as part of the research that we did, was it wasn't necessarily about totally removing cars per se.
Right.
It was about how do we help people who are maybe can't even afford one and don't have one already because they can't afford it, and there's equity challenges, connect to the opportunities because they can better connect to transit. And so perhaps it's almost the other way around. which is there's lots of people that can't afford the car. How do we help them with starting there? And then over time, as you improve the network, people who do have them might start to test and say, well, you know what, maybe one day a week I can take my kids and give this a go and see how it works. And it's this sort of gradual process rather than a big bang, I think.
I mean, we know that during the pandemic, when people stopped commuting to work, the GHG levels just plummeted, right? So we do know that if people move less, you get less impact, but we have to find a way to do that equitably that doesn't disadvantage people. Tosh, any other thoughts from you in terms of what you've learned about the sort of partnership approach that you're taking? You're trying to get a whole lot of people to make this their problem to solve, right? It's not just one entity.
Absolutely. No, I think we're now in this evaluation phase, so we're looking to do a little bit of learning ourselves, but how exactly we're positioning this MaaS tool that works to benefit transit riders, but really everything else as well. I think with our pilot here, we did a lot of deep link, which is kind of the lower level integrations into the transit app, and a few payment level with our transit system and bike share. And we're trying to learn, what level of convenience you gain from having all that payment integration. What level of uptake does that lead to? We kind of struck a balance there, and whether we have an app that is a little more branded and has that full integration and more payment plans, if that's something that can lead to better uptake of all of these modes, that'll be great for us. Or is it more that you're trying to align with some of the behaviors and patterns of the populace as they are? I mean, we chose the transit app because it was already very widely used in Pittsburgh prior to our pilot, and it has only improved its level of utilization. It's, I think now, from what we've seen, increased some of the utilization in those many modes and in bike share, and it's now kind of that preferred app for mobile payment. So there's a couple of different strategies you can take here.
This is all about friction, right? You're trying to decrease the friction, just make it much easier to choose to do it than to not do it, right? I have a sort of bugaboo question, which I want to ask, but Justin, I think you've been waiting to get in. Do you want to add something else in?
Oh, no, sorry, I was just twitching around, but to totally agree. The friction issue is a problem in all of this technology. Like, it's fine if the backend solution works, but nobody cares how it works or what's happening. It's like, can I access it easily? And is it simple to do? And if it's more than 2 clicks, most people lose interest. And I think that's the challenge here, because if I've got to load up an app and then I've got to pay through an Apple Pay, and everyone's like, what I'm getting in the car. And so that sort of almost user interface and I think the communication piece around what you're trying to achieve, I'm really interested here. Coming out of the back of this study saying, hey, look, we need to collaborate, we need to co-create, connect people. But how are we communicating what this is? There's a danger here that we might silo ourselves because we're saying, right, well, we're trying to help these people that don't have cars connecting here, and we lose the broader benefit. And so I'm really interested in the next step of that sort of communication, making sure we solve those social outcomes, but actually keep it open and make sure people don't go, well, it's 7 clicks on this and it's not relevant to me, I'm never looking at it again. Because I think you really lose out if you lose people straight away.
Can we go back to the democratization question, which is a big, heavy-duty word, but I think what it is getting at is choice. You want to have many choices, more choices than we have now, I guess. And then it begs the question, if we really want to provide a range of choices, we have to, I think, be more accepting of a range of ownership models. And there's been resistance to that, right? Because it can't all be publicly owned, publicly managed. How do you folks navigate that when people are concerned, it's the privatization of transportation and mobility? And I mean, cars have been privatized forever, but you know what I mean? How do you reassure people that we're going to still have access and that we can have the dynamics of the market and entrepreneurs trying new stuff and creating new stuff, but it will also still have accessible, safe services? How do you navigate that, Deborah? Come on, I gave you an easy one.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that one, Mary. I actually think that post-pandemic, this is an ideal time to have those conversations.
Right.
in the U.S. through APTA, and it's CUDA's having this too. The transit agencies are losing revenue.
Right.
Right. And when you lose revenue when you're in the private sector, that means your product isn't working.
Right.
So it's requiring people to look differently at what the model is. And there's lots going on at conferences. People are being challenged to do this. This is when you are required to talk to the other partners, because there's only so many resources. So it might be time to be thinking about that. And we're seeing some good models. And on communication, to Justin's point, Justin, we have to start telling these pilots and these models, but that's where people need help thinking about that. So if we could look at, and maybe Matthew's doing some research on this too, if we can look at some of those models in those communities. I love Tasha's, what they're doing there. I just love that story. So start telling that, and with a not-for-profit.
Yeah,
it's not going to be the same way. And you know what? We've had to change the paradigm for some time. We work with a lot of agencies that are still adamant they're going to provide the same type of service. So this is the golden opportunity. And those of us who are willing to help those entities, we can move forward some pilots. And that's what I think, again, we have to showcase those that are working, and look at those opportunities.
And we need our government, and we need our government folks, Justin. We need our government folks, like I see George Clayton and others from INFC on this call. You guys need to be thinking imaginatively about how do you create the enabling conditions, the basic infrastructure, so that those kinds of smaller tries can happen. Go ahead, Justin.
No, I was going to say, I think the point Deborah made again about the communication is critical, because I think you say, public-private partnership or privatization, everybody jumps to like a giant piece of infrastructure where they've lost all their taxpayers' dollars on. They're thinking, and we're not even talking about that. We're just saying, well, hang on, there's a solution out there that's doing a thing. Let's bring it in. Let's narrow it. And I think, frankly, in the GTA as well, we were scarred by the idea of digital cities. The Cyborg Labs thing. So everyone's got this preconception, and we can only break that down by trying to explain to them, what are we actually talking about? We can't just throw around privatization and expect everyone to be like, yeah, great idea. We've really got to put more effort into that sort of the communication part.
I'm interested in how Deborah's just challenged us about, if you were in the private sector and you were losing market share, you'd have to adapt and say, what the hell do we have to do differently? I think there's a lot of hand-wringing that's going on at the moment about how people are not on transit the way they once were. Public transit agencies are bleeding money. And it's an interesting question you're posing at us, Deborah, that do you have to then offer a different service? Because I think there are people who are quite afraid of transit at the moment in certain environments. It doesn't feel safe to them. Publicly managed, publicly administered, big, large transit systems, to some people, don't feel safe. Tosh, any thoughts on that? And Matthew, any thoughts on that? Can mobility as a service be presented as a safer choice?
Yeah, I think transit can benefit from restructuring to allow more discounted passes, so that you're providing a service to more people, gaining more benefits. I think that's something that we're piloting here through a couple of different pilots, of just creating those relationships with some of our biggest employers and just trying to get more people on the system. We're also having to just look at our city and how it functions in the wake of COVID, and particularly looking at downtown and trying to transition that into a more residential space where it is almost entirely business driven. I think when we look at downtown as being that hub to drive some of that transit oriented development, we can hopefully have some gains. I think we want to create some fun in riding transit again and getting out into public, like you were saying at the beginning. And we see all of these, micro mobility modes and, some of our other transportation options in the city as ways to create some joy in your commute a little bit. There's millions of ways to get around from A to B using all of these systems, and you can, discover your city in a new way. So that's, something that we've been thinking about and trying to communicate a little bit, but just one of many strategies.
You heard it here first, guys. Tosh is trying to put joy back in your commute. What a wonderful aspiration to have. Let's put the fun back into getting it. Because when we were kids, I mean, I used to get on the bus and it was totally fun. So I'm with you on that, the spirit of that. Matthew, other thoughts from you in terms of safety? Are we going to be able to position mobility as a service options as being safer? Is the risk less, maybe? Could you make that argument?
I think I don't know. It's a tricky question. And I think, I mean, speaking about wicked problems, right?
Yeah, I know.
And the challenge is, one of the things that's interesting is in this new world we're in both New York and Toronto, it was weekend and evening travel that recovered first, right? It was weekend and evening travel that recovered first on transit, as well as in all the other modes. And so safety is going to be a more important issue because for that reason, since more of that demand that has survived COVID is at night. And I think we have a lot of tools that are already out there that can help us with providing safe mobility options. We kind of know what it takes. We know that, simply telling people, oh, there's cameras in this station isn't enough because it doesn't. We also know who is more likely to actually be victimized by crime on transit. It's often, women with disabilities who are so overrepresented, unfortunately, in being targeted. And so it's just, again, actually going back to earlier part of the conversation, having the political will to invest in the resources that are going to make transit safer. And that also includes a design component, right? Like there's that one station on the up line in Toronto, Weston Station. If you're getting off on the east side, there's just a bunch of narrow hallways and tunnels that zigzag. That's not safe. Nobody's going to want to walk there and then across an empty parking lot at 11 o'clock at night, right? So
we need to call out our urban design colleagues and say, do better. Come up with make sure that we're doing good, basic human universal design principles when we do these things. And then in the meantime, what do we need to do? Go ahead, Deborah.
I want to go back to the safety comment, Matt. So that's struggling. We've done some our company's done some focus groups with some agencies, large agencies. And it was fascinating because we know that in COVID, people who had to commuted, but the white collar workers could stay home and they're still staying home, right?
Right.
But what was fascinating is we had people in some of those focus groups who said, I love transit. I used to love to do it. But you know what? The service isn't quality. And I saw some of this in the chat thing. And the report said that very well. We have to get back to the customer wants a more reliable service and improved. Okay. But the other thing that was fascinating to me is they said, you know what? If I go to the bus stop and it starts to rain, I go, well, I'm just going to go home because my boss will let me work from home today. So the choice riders, who are the one will then return to the urban center, are not going back. And that was maybe not a surprising finding. So I want to go back to your other question. You said, how do we do this as private sector? I believe public sector has to set out the standards and there has to be agreement, leadership about what are the trade-offs we want for our community around the quality of the transit system. Okay. And that's what it's going to cost. But we have to look at it. We used to do this. We'd go in and we'd do much more of the focus groups. We'd understand what people wanted. We talk to the employees. They know what the customers want. And then you develop your solutions to that. I mean, and Matt, a lot of the people were talking about, concerned about some of the stations. They're not doing the lighting right. They're not doing the community policing in a way. We used to look at that so that people were looking at the higher points where there might be more perception that it was unsafe and start doing more community policing where it's not happening in other parts of the line. I know we're doing that with another agency on the West Coast. So it's hard work. You have to look at the patterns, but that's what private sector, that's because they have to get the bottom line, but we have that responsibility as transit leaders too. to figure that out and frame it that way.
I mean, you're navigating.
There's room in the funding if you do it right.
You're navigating in a very mixed, heterogeneous space now. It used to be much more monoculture, publicly operated, certain limited kinds. Now you've got all these options of different things. In the last few minutes that we have left, what would you say would be the boldest thing that we could be doing to really solidify the future of mobility as a service in the cities in which we're locating? What are you lying in bed awake thinking that's the next opportunity? Matt, what is it?
Sorry, can you come back to me?
Yeah, I'll come back to you. I also want to just say that I teased Matt that he had an empty bookshelf behind him. He's just moved into a new place. And I said, keep that backdrop, and everybody here is going to send you a little note telling you what books you need to put in that backdrop behind you. So before we sign off, folks, put a book suggestion so Matthews knows what books he's going to get or borrow or have on the bookshelf the next time we see him. Who's ready? Deborah, what are you keeping? What are you staying awake at night thinking about?
When we work with our agencies and their boards, it's leadership.
Yeah.
It's been so politicized in our industry. There used to be, I can tell you, people who you know that are legends. They were able to frame the issues and be with the business community talking about this. We need people to stand up and talk about it from the business community and the leaders at the transit agencies and the boards. That's what will change it. I'm with you, Matt.
Tosh.
I'm glad Deborah went before me because I totally echo that as being uber important. I think about just information on your transit system when your bus is delayed or just not coming. I think when somebody's been burnt by transit, that really impacts whether they'll ride it in the future. And that's one of those low-hanging fruit things, I think. So just giving more tools to your riders to have information available so that they can plan their commute. That's what everybody wants, right? And we can make that happen.
So predictability, not even just predictability, just if you know, if somebody, that's why I like the people in the pennies. They just tell me, here's what you're going to do. Matthew, are you ready? If you got something that you can volley out?
Yeah, I think we need to fight to save transit service and restore transit service and prevent COVID-19 from being one of these permanent breaking points in sort of what has been this up and down battle of trying to save transit in North America.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right that we have to just assume that transit is part of our lives and that we need new kinds of arrangements and a new kind of understanding. I'm really going to continue to be provoked by Deborah's challenge to us. If people aren't taking transit, what are we doing to understand why? And what do we do to make the service more appealing so they will? Or maybe it's a different form of transit. Maybe this is a modal shift and it's going to not necessarily mean we stop. We just do it differently. Justin, what's keeping you up at night?
Well, I think if we think back to why this report was done, again, creating this kind of common language, a way to talk about this issue in the same way across all the people that see it. The one for me is similar to Deborah's leadership, is the next step of that is political will. How do we get the political will behind this to make it not just a nice conversation that then goes on the shelf, but actually goes into the solution thing? So maybe courage too, political will and courage.
Yeah, and maybe some imagination that there's not only one way, right? Which is why we're very appreciative of the report and the effort and the time. A number of you participated in the report, contributed to it. As we always say, this is, we do provocations. We're in the provocation business at CUI. We appreciate having AECOM's partnership to help lead this and to just say, what's next? We've been talking about what's working, what's not. Now we have to talk about what's next for transit and for mobility as a service. So thank you very much for joining us. Make sure that you look at the report and continue the conversation about what we think the next set of steps should be as we open up this conversation to look at all sorts of options and be responsive to what people need in their communities and how important mobility is to that being realized. Next City Talk is going to be about the case for libraries and the importance of libraries and civic institutions, particularly on main streets and downtowns. And that's actually linked to mobility because that's where people need to go, is to their library. And also, I think most of you know, at the end of November, we're busily working on the State of Canada Cities, a big national report and a national convening in Ottawa on the 30th of November. So you'll be hearing lots about that. But for now, thanks for joining us. Great to see you, Deborah, Matthew, Tosh, Justin. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks for the production team. Great to see you.